I was digging through my mother's purse for her insurance card in the ER. Her hands were shaking, she was moaning, the whole performance, and that's when I found it. A receipt from a costume shop for a wig, dated exactly 3 years ago, the same week she first told us she had cancer. My hands went completely still. Everything went silent. My name is Elizabeth, and I'm from Boston, Massachusetts. People always say that about narcissistic mothers, that you don't see it until you're older. That's not true for me. I saw it at 9 years old, standing in our kitchen doorway, watching my mother press her hand to her forehead and collapse onto the couch the exact moment my father walked through the front door. He rushed to her side, dropped his briefcase, forgot to say hello to me. I remember thinking, she was completely fine 2 minutes ago. She was humming. But I never said that out loud. Not once. Because in our house, questioning my mother wasn't disagreement. It was betrayal. Her name is Rosalind, and Rosalind has always been the sickest person in any room she walks into, long before cancer entered the picture. Migraines that arrived whenever someone else had good news. Back pain that flared up the morning of my high school graduation. A mysterious fatigue that kept her bedridden every single time I tried to have a serious conversation with her about my life. My younger sister Daphne never noticed any of it. Or maybe she chose not to. Daphne was the one who rubbed Mom's feet, brought her chamomile tea, and told me I was being cold whenever I asked a practical question. Daphne was the good daughter. I was the difficult one. That was decided before I was old enough to defend myself. 3 years ago, I had an offer from a firm in Chicago. A real one, the kind you work toward for a decade. I was packed. I was ready. And then Rosalind sat me down at her kitchen table, took both my hands in hers, and told me she had breast cancer, stage 2. Her voice was so steady it almost didn't seem real. I flew apart. I unpacked my boxes that same night. I called Chicago and told them I couldn't come. I stayed. I donated. I drove her to what I thought were appointments. I built my entire life around her illness. But there was one moment, maybe 4 months in, that I could never fully silence. We were walking to her car after what she called a rough chemo morning, and her wig shifted in the wind. She reached up and adjusted it. No hesitation, no tenderness, just a quick, practiced fix, the way you'd straighten a hat. Something in my stomach moved. I pushed it down. I told myself I was a terrible daughter for even noticing. I kept pushing it down for 3 more years. The first thing you need to understand about Rosalind is that she had perfect timing. Not the kind that comes from luck, the kind that comes from years of practice. Every single time something good happened in my life, her body found a way to need me more. I got a freelance contract, she had a reaction to her medication, and needed someone to sit with her overnight. I went on a first date that actually felt promising. She called at 8 p.m. crying, saying she couldn't breathe right. I stopped telling her my good news eventually. It felt safer that way, quieter. I didn't realize I was being managed. I thought I was just being a daughter. The GoFundMe was Daphne's idea, but Rosalind approved every word of it. They posted a photo of her in the wig, head slightly bowed, hands folded in her lap like a painting of suffering. The caption talked about her strength, her faith, her fight. Within 3 weeks, $43,000 had come in. Church members, old family friends, neighbors who barely knew our last name. I donated $400 myself. I remember feeling relieved to do it, like money could make up for the guilt I carried every time I had a private doubt. I never told anyone about those doubts, not even my closest friend. I was too ashamed of them. Then the will changed. I didn't find out directly. I never did with Rosalind's arrangements. I found out because Dad mentioned it without realizing I hadn't been told. A casual comment at Sunday dinner about updating things while there's still time. I asked him about it later in the driveway, just the two of us. He got quiet, looked at his keys, said Rosalind had felt strongly that the division should reflect who had been present during her illness. I nodded. I drove home. I sat in my parking lot for 40 minutes without going inside. I decided then that I would go to her next treatment with her. Not to catch her, I want to be clear about that. I genuinely still believed her. I just needed to be there, to feel like I was doing something real, instead of just writing checks and canceling plans. I told her the night before, gently, that I'd cleared my morning and wanted to come. What happened next still makes my jaw tight when I think about it. She didn't get sad. She didn't soften. Her face went completely flat, and she said, very quietly, "After everything I've been through, you still don't trust me. That's what you're telling me." She didn't speak to me for 4 days after that. I didn't go. But 2 weeks later, I was near the hospital anyway, a coffee shop 2 blocks down. And something pulled me inside. I told myself I was just going to ask about parking validation. I walked up to the front desk and gave them her name. The woman typed it in, looked at the screen, typed it again. Then she looked up at me with a careful, neutral expression and said, "I'm not finding anyone by that name in our system. Are you sure you have the right facility?" I said yes. I was sure. I walked back to my car, sat down, and stared at the steering wheel for a very long time. It was a Sunday dinner that broke everything open. Rosalind had been quieter than usual all evening, not her performative quiet, the kind designed to make you ask what's wrong. This was different, distracted, like she was somewhere else entirely. We were clearing the plates when she made a sound I'd never heard from her before. Not dramatic, not practiced, just a small, sharp exhale. And then she went down, chair scraping, glass hitting the floor, Daphne screaming her name from across the table. I called 911 before anyone else moved. Rosalind grabbed my wrist from the floor and said, "Don't, I just need to lie down." Her grip was surprisingly strong for a woman 3 years into chemotherapy. I called anyway. Daphne looked at me like I had done something violent. I stood by the door and waited for the ambulance with my arms crossed and something cold and steady moving through my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. At the hospital, they stabilized her quickly. No cardiac event, no neurological flag. The attending physician stepped into the hallway with me while Daphne stayed inside with Mom, holding her hand, stroking her hair. He was a younger doctor, direct in the way that people are when they've decided honesty is kinder than comfort. He looked at his tablet, then at me, and said, "I'm seeing no prior treatment history with any oncology department at this or any affiliated facility. No attending physician on record, no chemotherapy administration, nothing." He paused. "Has she been receiving treatment somewhere else?" I heard the words. I understood them individually, but for a moment they didn't assemble into meaning. I told him I needed a minute. I walked back into the room, picked up Rosalind's purse from the chair beside her bed, and told Daphne I was looking for her insurance card. My hands were steady in a way that surprised me. I unzipped the inside pocket. There were receipts folded in there, the way she always kept them, neat, organized, date-ordered. And near the bottom, soft at the fold lines from being handled, was one I didn't recognize. A store I didn't know. A category listed at the top of the itemized slip. Theatrical hairpieces and costume accessories. Date of purchase, 3 years and 11 days ago. The same week she told us she had cancer. I put the receipt in my own pocket. I set her purse back on the chair. I kissed Daphne on the top of the head because I didn't trust my voice. I walked down the hall to the single-stall bathroom near the elevator bank, locked the door, looked at myself in the mirror, and laughed. Not the way you laugh at something funny. The way you laugh when the alternative is something you can't afford to do in a hospital bathroom at 9 p.m. on a Sunday. I laughed until my shoulders shook, until it turned into something else entirely. Until I slid down the wall and sat on that cold tile floor, and finally let myself know what I had always, somewhere underneath everything, already known. My mother never had cancer, not one single day of it. I gave myself exactly 11 minutes on that bathroom floor. I know, because I watched the clock on my phone the whole time. Something to focus on while everything I thought I understood about the last 3 years rearranged itself into something I didn't have words for yet. Then I stood up, ran cold water over my wrists, dried my hands, and walked back down that hallway. Rosalind was sitting up in the bed when I came back in, color already returning to her face, talking to Daphne about whether the hospital gown was the right size, performing recovery the same way she had performed illness, efficiently, convincingly, for whoever was in the room. I pulled the chair close to her bed and sat down. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I set the receipt on the blanket beside her hand, and I said, very quietly, "I need you to tell me the truth. Right now. Not a version of it. The truth." The room went completely still. Rosalind looked at the receipt, then she looked at me, and something shifted in her face that I had never seen before in 51 years of being her daughter. Not guilt, not remorse, but calculation. A rapid, almost mechanical recalibration. And then she said, "You have no idea what you're doing right now. You are going to destroy this family, and you are going to do it because you have always needed to be right more than you needed to love us." Daphne stepped forward. "Elizabeth, what is going on?" I handed Daphne my phone, the doctor's name, the statement he'd made in the hallway, which I had typed out word for word the moment he walked away. The receipt photo I had already taken before putting it in my pocket. Daphne read it standing up, one hand pressed flat against the wall beside her like she needed it to stay vertical. I watched her face move through denial, confusion, and then something that cracked open quietly behind her eyes. The specific expression of someone realizing that a story they built their identity around was never true. "Mom," she said. Just that. Just her name. Rosalind's answer was to burst into tears and say her chest hurt. Neither of us moved toward her. That was the moment I felt it. Not rage, not triumph, not the relief I had expected. It was something heavier and stranger than any of those things. 30 years of carrying the label of difficult, paranoid, cold, ungrateful. And it hadn't dissolved. It had just become visible for what it always was. Someone else's lie, pressed into my skin so long it had started to feel like my own. My father was standing in the doorway. I don't know how long he'd been there. He didn't say a word. He just looked at my mother in that hospital bed. And then he looked at me. And then he looked at the floor. And in that silence I understood that he had carried his own version of knowing, quieter than mine, buried deeper, for a very long time. The hospital social worker came the next morning. Not because I demanded it, because the attending physician had already filed the report before I even left the building that Sunday night. Apparently what I had described in that hallway conversation crossed a threshold that required mandatory documentation. Rosalind was referred for a full psychiatric evaluation, not suggested, not offered as an option. Required as a condition of her discharge paperwork. I found out later there's a name for what she had been doing. Factitious disorder, sometimes called Munchausen syndrome, a condition where a person fabricates or induces illness to occupy the role of patient, to control, to gather, to keep people close through fear instead of love. Reading that clinical definition on my phone in my apartment at midnight felt like finally being handed a map of a place I had been lost in my entire life. The GoFundMe was reported to the platform the following week. I made the call myself, quiet, factual, no dramatics. The platform froze the remaining funds and began the reversal process. The church found out not through any announcement, but through their own pastor, who had visited Rosalind during her supposed treatment and had quietly begun asking questions of his own after her hospitalization. The congregation learned the truth the way most truths spread in close communities, gradually, then all at once. I wasn't there for any of it. I didn't need to be. My father called me on a Thursday afternoon, about 3 weeks after everything. He didn't mention Rosalind. He didn't mention the hospital, or the GoFundMe, or any of it. He just asked if I could come by the house Saturday morning. When I arrived, he was sitting at the kitchen table with a manila envelope in front of him. He slid it across to me without a word. Inside was a copy of his updated will, my name restored, the division rebalanced, dated 4 days after that Sunday dinner. He poured us both coffee. We talked about the weather and a book he was reading and whether the Sox had any chance this season. He never said I'm sorry, but he stayed at that table with me for 2 hours, which for my father was its own language entirely. Justice in real life doesn't look like a courtroom scene. It doesn't come with music or a villain's confession or a moment where everyone finally sees what you always saw. It comes quietly, in a manila envelope slid across a kitchen table, in a phone call from a GoFundMe platform, in a psychiatric referral that cannot be refused, in a sister who stops defending someone she can no longer defend and calls you on a Wednesday just to say, "I'm sorry I didn't listen sooner." Daphne said those words to me exactly 26 days after that Sunday dinner. I had pulled over in a parking lot to take her call. When she finished talking, I just said, "I know," because I did. And because some things, once they're said out loud, don't need anything added to them. Here is what nobody tells you about growing up with a mother like Rosalind. The manipulation doesn't feel like manipulation while it's happening. It feels like love. It feels like need. It feels like you are the only person standing between someone fragile and complete collapse. And so you stay. You cancel. You donate. You shrink. You hand over years of your life with both hands because the alternative, walking away from a sick mother, is something you cannot live with. That guilt wasn't accidental. It was architected, built specifically to fit the shape of you, placed exactly where it would hold you longest. The hardest thing I have had to learn is this. Your perception was never the problem. The problem was that you were surrounded by people who needed your perception to be wrong. When everyone in a room is calling you paranoid, It is worth asking who benefits most from you doubting yourself. In my case, the answer was always the same person. I also learned that healing from this kind of betrayal is not a single moment. It is not the confrontation, or the receipt, or the hospital report. It is every ordinary morning after, when you wake up and realize you made a decision yesterday that was entirely your own. When you notice that your chest doesn't tighten when your phone rings. When you stop rehearsing conversations in your head with someone who is no longer in your daily life. 6 weeks after that Sunday dinner, I called Chicago. The position had been filled. Of course it had. But they had something else opening in the fall. I said yes before they finished the sentence. The morning I flew out, I got a window seat. I put my phone on airplane mode before we even pushed back from the gate. I watched Boston get smaller underneath me, and I didn't feel sad. I felt like someone who had finally, after a very long time, stopped carrying something that was never hers to carry in the first place. If you made it all the way here, thank you. Not for watching, for staying. Because I know some of you didn't just listen to Elizabeth's story. You lived a version of it. Maybe nobody faked cancer, but somebody in your life faked something. Fragility, helplessness, need. And you rearranged yourself around it for years because you loved them and because leaving felt unthinkable. If you were ever called paranoid for being right, I want to hear from you. Drop it in the comments. Just those 4 words if that's all you have. I was called paranoid. And if this story felt like yours in any way, share it with someone who needs to know they're not crazy for what they sensed. They never were.